If I can just say the Voila dashboards, this would be then for decision makers. So geospatial experts, you develop your code and then you bring your results into a dashboard, which you can then bring to decision makers and your client. And so they see then the maps and the outcomes and the information they need for making the decisions.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Julia Wagemann, and we're going to be talking about the Jupyter project, and we're really going to be focusing on Jupyter Notebooks. So what are they, why we should be thinking about using them, and what they might look like in the future. Julia mentions a lot of great resources and links in this episode, and if you want to get your hands on them, please join our email list. So go along to mapscaping.com/podcast, sign up for the email, and I'll be sure to send those to you with the other show notes. One more thing from me, if you haven't subscribed already, consider doing so. This is a weekly podcast, and if you subscribe, you can be sure that you won't miss out on any of the future episodes. Okay, that's it from me. Let's get into the interview. Hey Julia, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this interview with me. Really appreciate your time here. So today we're going to be talking about Jupyter Notebooks. This is not something I have a ton of experience, so I'm really looking forward to your insights on this topic. And I think just before we dive into that, it would be really useful for the listeners if we could just get a little bit of your background. If you could just take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself.
Sure. Yes. Hi, Daniel. First of all, thank you also for inviting me to the podcast. Yes, my name is Julia. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Marburg and a visiting scientist at the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. And my PhD is about big data technologies for meteorological and climate data. So I investigate how we can make geospatial and specifically meteorological and climate data better accessible to users and make cloud-based services work for users to get a better access to data. And also, I started since last year working as a geospatial data consultant and have there's contracts developing tutorials and workflows with Jupyter Notebooks.
Wow. So after hearing that, I have a feeling that maybe we're going to have you back on the podcast at some other stage to talk about some of these other topics, because that sounds really, really fascinating. But the topic of today is Jupyter. So perhaps we could start with Jupyter as a project. So if I go to Jupyter, I see a couple of different things. I see Jupyter Labs, I see Jupyter Notebooks, and I see something called the Jupyter Hub. Would you mind just sort of walking us through those three things? Just sort of give us an overview of what they are before we dive into the actual notebook.
Yes, sure. I think many people have the problem really understanding what Jupyter means, and I try to break it down a bit. So first of all, yes, it's not. If we talk about Jupyter, it's not only Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter is a project, and behind this project, I would say already it's an ecosystem of tools and services you can use to develop open source code and tutorials and for reproducible research. And first of all, this is how it started. Jupyter Notebooks. This is I can say a web-based interface where you can combine code, documentation, data access, and also the output of your code or workflow into one Jupyter Notebook, into one interface. And I think this was the innovation of Jupyter Notebooks, really, because before you had your code somewhere, then you had your output in a different folder. You needed to open and click it to see actually what your work did, what your code did. And you also had your data somewhere. And now you can actually have everything into one interface. This is Jupyter Notebooks. Then we have the Jupyter Hubs. And this is basically a hub where multiple users can get access to the Jupyter Notebooks. So Jupyter Hubs are tremendously helpful for teaching and education because, if let's say you teach a class in geospatial analysis with Python, for example, then before we had Jupyter Hub, people needed to install a bunch of packages and libraries, and it took already an hour until everyone had the same setup. And now with the Jupyter Hub, people can log in and they already have the environment they need, and they can basically just jumpstart with the lesson and what you actually want to teach about, rather than how to install packages and libraries. So this is a Jupyter Hub, and then Jupyter Lab, and this is now the next step. It's an interactive, web-based software development environment. So you can, it's now. You can have different notebooks open. So it's now getting really more into developing software with Jupyter Notebooks on a modular, with a modular approach. So this is it's a desktop-based software you can install, and it's similar to PyCharm for Python. It's just for Jupyter Notebooks and really developing code with Jupyter Notebooks. And then this is something very new. This is now the step after you developed workflows and you have visualizations developed in your notebooks. Then there's a new project that's called Voila, and this is actually now that you can present your results in a web-based application. So you can create web applications with Jupyter Notebooks in the backend.
So there's a lot to take in there. I think I'll just take a minute here just to try and summarize some of this, and we'll sort of head off in towards the Jupyter Notebook land in just a second. So I thought it was really interesting that this Jupyter Hub. So it sounds like this is the place where I set up my environment, create all the packages that need to be available to students in this example, so they don't need to figure that out. And then part of that environment is like a window into that environment, and that's the Jupyter Notebook. Am I right so far?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so I log on to somewhere and I get access to my notebook. Can you tell me what it looks like, and perhaps also what kind of languages are available to me in that environment?
So in the Jupyter Hub, it really depends how the Jupyter Hub is set up, but Jupyter supports dozens of different programming languages. For geospatial mainly, I would say very important is Python and R, but also JavaScript and other Julia and other programming languages. And yeah, in Jupyter Hub, so if you enter, you basically see a list of files, I would say, which each file can be it can be a notebook, and so you open a file, and then a notebook starts, and either it's already a predefined notebook. So for teaching, for example, you probably already developed some content where the students can go through, but you can also start a notebook from scratch, and then you can develop your own workflow. But then you can also combine it on the Jupyter Hub, of course, with folders where you store your data or some images, etc. But this is the general interface. Once you enter Jupyter Hub, then it just looks like a list of different files.
Okay, and again, these files are all things that are available to me through my Jupyter Notebook. So now I'm in my notebook. Can you describe for the listeners what the notebook looks like and what the process is like? Because it's a little bit different from perhaps coding in something like PyScript or PyCharm.
Exactly, and I think this is also the strength of Jupyter Notebooks, because it makes the barrier to get started with coding much smaller, I would say. So let's say I always compare it with a Google Docs file. So basically, you have a sheet, so it looks like a sheet. So you have a navigation pane or a menu on top where you can add another cell, or you can. So it's similar to Google Docs. And then a notebook consists of different cells. And so you can add a new cell, and each cell you can specify if this cell should be filled with code or if it should be filled with Markdown. And Markdown means this is a cell where I then have, in the end, text and documentation for my workflow, for example. Yes, and this is the way how you set up a notebook and entire workflows with it. So you you add different type of cells, and then you can add text or code into the cells, and in the end you have a full workflow.
So I really like the idea that this environment is already made for me. I log in. It sounds like a really simple, user-friendly interface, and the sort of mashup of code and documentation in the one place. I think that's really clever. We talked a little bit about different languages that were available to us. Do I have to choose a language and commit to that language all the way through my Jupyter Notebook page, or can I swap and change? Can I write a function in Python and have that feed into something from R? Is that a possibility?
Yes, certainly. So you can have both. So each notebook. So how a notebook works is with kernels, and so each notebook has a base kernel. So either the notebook is based on a Python kernel or R kernel or the other programming language. But you can have the support. So you can either have one notebook just fully in Python and the other notebook fully in R. For example, you can. You can so this is what I often do. I pre-process my data with Python and Xarray. I save the result, and then I use R and ggplot for visualization. But then you can have another notebook where you can visualize the data. But now it's even possible. There is a package where you can transfer objects from between Python and R, for example. So you can bring an object from Python, you can cast it as an R object, and then you can even mix both languages in one workflow, and you can make use of both the advantages of both programming languages within one notebook.
So that sounds amazing. It sounds like a pretty flexible environment to be working in. One of the things I really like about this is now I don't have a great deal of experience with it, is this idea that I can create a cell. So I write my code in that cell and I can execute that and I get an output, like a visual output, if that's what the output is at the bottom of it. And I can sort of step through my workflow like that, executing along the way and seeing what the result is. And this reminds me a lot of the debugging process when I'm writing code in another editor, where you kind of step through the workflow, and it seems very visual. It's not immediately obvious what you've done, because I don't think any code is completely self-documenting. We need some kind of descriptions in there, but I really like the way that sort of visual representation of what's happening at each step.
I agree totally. Yes. So you have everything in one environment and where you work. So you also get directly the error, and it's also very easy to execute your cell, and then you see if it works, if it goes through, or if you have to debug and you have to change something in your code. But if it goes through, then at the same time you already have also the output. If it's a map or a plot or your data structure, this is also very helpful that you have directly the print statement, and you can see the structure of your data.
So we've talked a little bit about this, but I want to sort of dive deeper into it now and talk about what problems Jupyter Notebooks are solving. So obviously we've got this sort of pre-built environment. We can make a pre-built environment for our students if that's the use case. We have this sort of very visual way of programming. We can combine a whole bunch of different languages. But I think that Jupyter Notebooks are solving an even bigger problem here. And that, for me, is perhaps that reproducibility, that visual aspect of what did the process look like. Could you talk a little bit about that, and perhaps any other problems that you see that Jupyter Notebooks are designed for, that are solving?
Yes, sure. Yes, I certainly agree. With Jupyter Notebook, I probably wouldn't say that reproducibility is already solved because we have Jupyter Notebooks now, but it's definitely a big step forward towards having better reproducible code, reproducible workflows, and then also reproducible science, because there is a set of services available with Jupyter Notebooks that it's easier for people also to collaborate on code and on a workflow. And I think if more people use Jupyter Notebooks and also share their research and their workflows and their data processing code, then not everyone has to reinvent the wheel again. And so they can also take already some workflows that have been already developed, and then they can even go the next step and one step further. I think this is for reproducible research. It's a really helpful tool and a big step forward. It's other challenges. Yes, it makes it very easy to collaborate on code. Someone develops a workflow. You can then so on Jupyter Hub, for example, for teams, they can it's not only for teaching, but also teams can collaborate on Jupyter Hub and can together develop code and workflows and data analysis pipelines. But also you can host Jupyter notebooks on GitHub, for example, and then people can directly see it, and they can also comment it and give some comments and advice what can be actually improved. Other challenges Jupyter Notebooks might solve. Yeah, I think we said reproducibility. And another challenge, I think, is specifically Jupyter Hub and then Jupyter Notebook solve is also, it brings the code to the data, or it can bring code to the data. Because for now, it's still often that you have to download large volumes of data. You have to have storage space on your local machine or on another server, and then you can process the data. And with Jupyter Hub, specifically, if you also link it to a cloud storage in the back end, you can actually bring the code to the data, and you can analyze or you can process your code where the data is. And there's one community project. It's called PanGeo, specifically for the geoscience community, for climate and ocean data. They now bring basically a set of open source tools together to make data processing more reproducible, but also more efficient. And the set of open source tools is Python, Jupyter Hub, and Jupyter Notebooks, and also cloud storage where the data is stored.
So firstly, I just want to say I love this idea, and I love that we're moving forward to taking code to the data. To me, it gives so many more options, so many more possibilities. It means, for example, that I can share my block of code with someone else, and they can point at the same data source, execute it, and test it out, and then sort of build on it in the way we build on science in general. That idea that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, that no idea is completely original, and building on other people's work, and that seems to be like one of the things that are really going to push us forward in terms of scientific development. So really excited about that idea. I'm wondering if you talked just in the last few sentences there, you talked about how this project, and I'll need to get a link off you later on so I can include it in the show notes, that was designed or sort of focused on the geospatial community. Are there any particular problems that Jupyter is solving in terms of geospatial? So apart from bringing things together and self-documenting, I mean, we can apply those principles to any sort of any industry, I guess I could say. But is there any specific geospatial problems that Jupyter helps solve?
I would say Jupyter Notebooks is specifically helpful for geospatial data analysis, because geospatial data analysis in the end is also very visual. To come to effective visualization of your problem, you often have like a bunch of like large volumes of data behind which you have to modify and process, and then you get your result which you then can communicate. And I think specifically the challenges you have in geospatial analysis are in each step. I think geospatial workflows, they address, or we have the challenges Jupyter Notebooks address. So first of all, yes, having an easier access to the data, to large volumes of data, and also, and then at the same time to directly have an output, our map or visualization or plot to have everything together. I think specifically for geospatial, what could be, or which is also useful, is the what I already mentioned, to bring different programming languages together so that we actually set up one workflow, but with different programming languages, code snippets. I think I like both. I wouldn't say I'm just a Python or just a R person, because I see the advantages of both programming languages for different tasks. And so I think we should also more put the focus and emphasis it more to take advantages of the different programming languages and combine it in one workflow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So oftentimes I talk to people and they're almost married to one particular thing, like it's open source or it's Esri or it's Python or it's R or something like that. And it seems to me that I guess I can totally understand. You spend a lot of time, energy, resources, becoming an expert in this piece of software, this particular tool. But I think the opportunity here is to use the best tool for the job. Whether that's R, whether it's Python, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's something else. And I think that this seems to me to be the opportunity that Jupyter Notebooks offers us, on top of everything else, of course. So up until now, we've talked a lot about the advantages of Jupyter Notebooks, and a lot of it seems to revolve around this idea of reproducibility, of transparency, of openness, and of course the network effect. But I'd like to push back on that a little bit, because I also hear people say that they're not really interested in how we got to the answer. They just want the result. Don't get us bogged down in the exact technique you used or the tools that you employed to do this. Just tell me what the result is. And I think as geospatial professionals, we have a little bit of a problem here, because at one time, on one side of the argument, we're supposed to be open, like how document how we got there, and the other side of it, perhaps the decision makers aren't necessarily interested in how we got there. They're just expecting us to have done our job correctly and give a result that's valid.
Yes, I agree. I think in the end, yes, they probably depending on who we develop the workflow and also the final result for, they probably also don't necessarily have the expertise in giving advice or feedback how the workflow can be improved. So in the end, because there's a specific company, they interested in geospatial analysis, and they actually need just a number or a plot or a map where they, for example, can start reforestation project, for example, or where there's some different natural resources, or where there's vegetation. And so they just interested in this information, which then they can actually bring forward to the company and also make decisions on it. And I think I wouldn't say that Jupyter Notebooks is specifically made for decision makers or clients. I think it's more it's a really good tool for team collaboration. So for people who know how to code, for people who are not necessarily, I think you don't have to know how to code. I think also Jupyter Notebooks, they make it much easier to start your coding journey if you're interested in. But also for Jupyter Notebooks, also for people who know about geospatial data and what can be done, and also what about different processing ways. And does this answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I totally agree with you here. I think that, we've got to think about our audience sometimes. Like, what do these people need to hear? What answer are they looking for? What are they able to understand? So I think it really depends on who we're communicating to. I can definitely see the advantages here for the scientific community, definitely for educators. I mean, this seems like an incredible tool for that. But I'm not necessarily convinced that this is a tool for decision makers. I think a lot of the decision makers I have had the privilege of working with, they're more sort of interested in the result. Okay, they're expecting me as a professional to have done my work well and diligently and present them with an end result that then they can add into their decision-making equation. So that's kind of my take on it. And I think that we're in agreement here.
If I can just say like the Voila dashboards, this would be then for decision makers. So geospatial experts, you develop your code and then you bring your results into a dashboard, which you can then bring to decision makers and your client. And so they see then the maps and the outcomes and the information they need for making the decisions. I think as a product, the Voila dashboards is for decision makers, so to present the results, but of course not what is in the back end, just then the web application.
I'll be sure to include notes and links from that in the show notes so people can go there and have a look for themselves. I'm just a little bit conscious of the time now, and I have a few more questions, so I'd like to move on to those. What do you think this is going to look like in the future? So we've got this great environment. Obviously, a lot of development is happening. We're moving on to Jupyter Labs, for example, where perhaps people are going to be using this to develop software in teams. Is there anything else on the horizon in terms of Jupyter that you can see coming?
Well, I think something very new is now the Voila dashboards, because there is a tool or package available for Jupyter Notebooks already for quite a few years. It's Jupyter Widgets, where you have like these interactive modules to change input data. So you could have a button or like a slider. And so a lot of people, they ask me the past years, Jupyter Widgets, it's quite nice, but actually I don't see what do I do with these widgets. And now this is now the next step. So the widgets can now be integrated into these Voila dashboards to really develop nice web applications. Other than that, Jupyter Notebooks is a lot of people use Jupyter Notebooks, but what I would like to emphasis or point out is that it's not just because you use Jupyter Notebooks that it's automatically reproducible, understandable, and useful for the community. And so because it's so easy to start with Jupyter Notebooks, at the same time, it's also, you have to actually invest additional time and I would say the extra mile to actually make Jupyter Notebooks or your Jupyter Notebook and your workflow self-explanatory and also reproducible. And so it's not automatically just because you use Jupyter Notebooks that you do reproducible research. So it's still that you have to you have to go the extra mile to make it also to make an efficient notebook, I would say. So, and this means it is time to document really also for teaching purposes. It's time that you also think about how do you structure your notebook, how you structure your workflow, how you document it, that it is also understandable.
Thank you very much for that. Just one last question here. Do you see, so it sounds like there's a real future for Jupyter Notebooks or Jupyter as a project, I should say. So it's developing, it's evolving all the time. If I'm just starting out and wanting to get into coding and for geospatial purposes, is this something I should be investing my time in?
I would certainly I would certainly say so, but maybe I'm biased. I'm not sure. But I think, yes, specifically if you haven't coded before, then I think it's a very nice, neat and easy interface. And also an interface you probably also know about because you worked with other like a Google Docs or something in the browser before. And so when I taught some courses before, I always had like the impression that people specifically if they start out, that they quite, how do you say, afraid of coding, and then I could break something, and they don't understand the interface of software development environments. And so I think this is a bit lower down the barrier to actually get started. And I would certainly say so, yes.
Julia, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for coming along today and teaching us all a little bit about the Jupyter project and especially Jupyter Notebooks and how and why we might get started with it. Much appreciated. Before I let you go, where can the listeners go to reach out to you if they have questions, or do you have any links that you'd like to share with them where they can go to find out more?
Yes, I'm on Twitter, Julia Wagemann, and I also have a website where I share some examples on or on GitHub. I would say GitHub is even better. It's also Julia Wagemann, and there I share some notebooks and tutorials and courses I developed based on Jupyter Notebooks.
Thanks again, Julia. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that episode with Julia and talking about Jupyter Notebooks. Just remember that all the links and resources mentioned in this will be available on our website at mapscaping.com, and I also send them out in a weekly email. So if you would like to join that email list, go along to mapscaping.com/podcast. I'll send you an email every week with all the links, notes, and resources mentioned in each episode. And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel. It's been a pleasure being your host again this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you to all the people that are taking the time to share this podcast with a friend. It really helps grow the community and is just wonderful. I really, really appreciate it. Okay, so I'll be back again next week with another episode. Tune in then. We'll talk soon. Bye.